I'm talking to Professor Fader. She is a professor of anthropology at Fordham University, and she is the author of numerous books, including Mitzvah Girls, Bringing Up the Next Generation of Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn, and this book right here, which I just recently completed, Hidden Heretics, Jewish Doubt in the Digital Age. Professor Fader, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today and to talk about your book. I'm really appreciative.
It's my pleasure to be here, really.
Okay. So my first question is, as someone living in New York, the Haredi world is very ubiquitous. I actually work down in Brooklyn, and I drive through uh like the Satmar area of Brooklyn every day on my way to work. Um, and so what drew you to write about this world, to think about this world, to study this world? Why the Haredi world?
That's a really good question. I'm a New Yorker too. But I chose this topic in graduate school actually for both personal and intellectual reasons. So when I was in graduate school, it was a moment in anthropology where anthropologists were really questioning this study of the exotic other, like going to faraway places and how that re-exoticized certain people. So I was influenced by that. And one of the ways that people responded to that was by sort of quote unquote studying their own communities. I did not grow up in a Hasidic community. I grew up in a Reform community. I didn't grow up in Brooklyn. I'm from Manhattan, but um, I was always very curious, and this is where the personal part comes in. My grandparents, some of them, had been more Orthodox, some less. There was very little that we knew about my own family. And so I was curious. I was going to study language, and I knew very little about Yiddish. My family spoke more Hebrew. And so partly it was for the intellectual, how can we have a more just anthropology? And partly it was as a Jewish New Yorker, what can I learn about my own past? And of course, by studying Hasidic people or Haredi people, I certainly learned about the present more than the past, but it required also doing a lot of reading about the past.
Hmm. And so I guess there's sort of this tension or this interplay between what's so close and familiar, but also so far. This sense of you drive through Brooklyn and you see a world which is your neighbors in a way. I mean, they do business in the same places, and they're walking around with their families, but also so distant. Uh,
Exactly. And even as a kid, we took trips to Williamsburg from Manhattan to go see Haredi Jews with my Hebrew school and also with my family and to go to Heimische bakeries and things. Like it was for us going to another world, and it was important for me to go in the present as I do my field work and realize it's not another world. They're related to me in some ways. We might share history, we might share space in New York. But what I learned through all of my research is how different in many ways I am from the people that I work with.
yeah, and that again, that's that tension there, that the similarity and difference. Your book, I think, explores that. It explores the difference, but also the shared humanity. The fact that they're different, but they're also like us in the same time. You know,
Exactly. I
and
actually think that's part of the beauty of anthropology is that there is a willingness to kind of make that leap of imagination and build relationships where you come to, you hope, know at least a little bit about a person who you might never have had a relationship with.
yeah, and I think growing up in the Orthodox world, there's there's a lot of interplay and interfacing with that Haredi world. And like I grew up in the Orthodox world, and I think there's often a fetishization of Haredim. There's a sense in these, and the question of why is a complicated question. It relates, I think, to a lot of factors, but there's a sense in these schools that like the Haredim are really doing it right, you know. Especially I think in the modern Orthodox world, that's very common. And so again, these themes of closeness and distance, because that world is so insular, and even to modern Orthodox Jews, it's inaccessible at the same time, you know. And so I think for me as a reader of the book and thinking about these things, it also felt very, yeah, very relevant in a way.
Yeah, I could totally see that. And I think you're right. Um, and I experienced that from the other perspective as a mostly secular Jewish anthropologist, I heard from my advisors and some of my friends and my colleagues, like, oh, they're the real Jews that you're working with, or they're so isolated, they're some kind of throwback to a pre-modern past. I think neither of those, of course, is correct. But I think those kinds of ideas about authenticity and what makes something real Judaism circulate, you know.
Yeah. So, how does one go about studying the Haredi world? How did you gain access or trust in this community?
So I think, I mean, this is a challenge for any anthropologist, but you're right that Haredim are perhaps more closed. I think it's hard in urban contexts also. You know, people are in their apartments, like there's no big house or outside space where people congregate in that way. For Hidden Heretics, I had some connections already for my first book, Mitzvah Girls, and I began with those. And very quickly, I found a group of men who were very willing to talk to me. And, you know, sort of to narrate how they began to doubt and all of those kinds of things. But part of anthropology and the method of anthropology is ethnography is not only interviewing, but it's also something called participant observation, which is when you participate and observe. And it's less like question and answer and more just trying to participate as much as you can. So I was frustrated, number one, because I never met any women, and number two, because I didn't do any participant observation. I kept inviting myself to different events, and people were like, no, 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 you can't come. So part of ethnography is patience. So I kept interviewing people. I kept asking them, like, how come I'm not meeting any women? Little by little, a few women were willing to talk to me. You know, as you establish trust with one person, they recommend you to another person. And the same thing with events. There were more social gatherings than my first book. I could go to inspirational lectures like shears and stuff that were open to anybody. Here, there were very few kind of events that I could go to. But eventually, with time, I got invited to parties, to outings, to things like that. I went to some weddings, which was really interesting, and just spending time with people.
I read Hidden Heretics. I did not read Mitzvah Girls, and I'm very intrigued. So, could we maybe take a step back and talk about the relationship between these two books, and maybe if you could introduce a little bit about Mitzvah Girls to someone who is unfamiliar?
Yes, sure. So, Mitzvah Girls started out as a study of why little Hasidic girls in Brooklyn, Bubov in particular, were who were fluent speakers of Yiddish and English, stopped speaking Yiddish after first grade. But it quickly grew to be more of a study of Hasidic girlhood and how parents raise their daughters to want to stay in these communities despite living in the middle of New York. So I talk a lot about tznius, about modesty, and about how language and clothing and head coverings get are spoken about with kids and then later teenagers. And I followed the life cycle of the Hasidic little girls that I started with who were in kindergarten and pre 1A. And then I went to a bride class later. I had a hard time getting access to teens, so I didn't work with teens very much on occasion at Shabbos's. But so that book was really about socializing kids into becoming Hasidic women. This book is really different. It was with adults, it's with religious doubt, not religious belief or faith or practice, even. And it was really about conflicts in the community more than anything else and about the kinds of changes that I had seen. Like my first book came out in 2009, and I did the fieldwork for that in the late 90s. My second book was really from like the mid 2000s and it came out in 2020. So very different time periods. And like when I was first doing Mitzvah Girls, I didn't even have a cell phone. I mean, kind of was no internet back then, which is hard to imagine. But I was really struck when I was writing Mitzvah Girls at the kinds of responses that Rabbanim and certain leaders, community leaders, were having to the internet and then later specifically to smartphones. So I got really intrigued. I was really only going to write one article. I was very curious about all the Hasidic blogs that were going on, that whole like mid 2000s blogosphere. And so I thought I'd write one article, but about doubt, really. And then I realized that there was this whole community of people who had lost their faith but decided to stay. Like I didn't know that those people existed. I'm sure they existed when I was writing Mitzvah Girls, but the internet had really intensified and made possible certain ways of living those kinds of double lives, as people call them. And so I started working on that quite by accident.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to think about how in the year 2025, the post-internet world in a city like Brooklyn or anywhere, like what keeps people in the fold, you
Exactly.
know? And I think there's sort of a lot of different answers, and it depends, of course, on, what that fold looks like. I
Right.
think like in the modern Orthodox world, it's an interesting question. I think it's a question, for historians, like how does a modern version of Orthodox Judaism survive, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
Actually, I'll tell you that people told me, Haredi people told me that there are many more double lifers among the modern Orthodox. I don't know, but that it's much easier to be a double lifer and that it's like a whole untapped area.
yeah, I I think that's probably true.
Yeah.
I don't know which one has more, but um, do you feel like these communities, like I think like again, in the modern Orthodox world, I believe that modern Orthodoxy exists because it fills something for people. It does something for people. And when I drive through these places in Brooklyn and I see the Hasidim there, I sort of have the same sense. Does that resonate with you? There's a sense that these communities fill some sort of need. Does that resonate or not resonate?
Oh yeah, totally. Like I met so many I mean over the years, the decades, I've met so many people who are thrilled that they're living this kind of life and can't see any other kind of life. I think in my earlier work with kids, I saw how important it was to fit in a certain kind of way, let's say for girls, if you were going to live it very happily there, and that it was harder if you couldn't make yourself fit in. But that's any community. I think you're right that there have been a lot of changes, structural changes to Jewish orthodoxies more generally. And but yeah, of course, like absolutely, there's a sense from I would say like much more in my earlier work, but from Mitzvah Girls, there's a sense like this kind of Yiddishkeit is beautiful. This is what we're meant to be doing. A real kind of obligation to continuing and rebuilding what the Holocaust destroyed. I mean, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that your book does really beautifully is you draw parallels between sort of the questions that these insular communities are going through and what people in the modern world are going through. For example, our relationship with technology. That's like a universal question. And one of the thoughts that came up to me a lot when reading the book, and I feel like it's in the book, but maybe there's some level of projecting as well. But you can tell me. You can tell me to what extent this is me and to what extent this is you. But the sense in which modernity leaves something wanting in our lives. That there's a place for alternative ways of living in the modern world because I think modernity doesn't have all the answers for living uh in a way which feels filled up. Is that something that makes sense or no?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I critiqued in Mitzvah Girls is the way that Haredim are portrayed as anti-modern or not modern. A lot of historians have shown that it is only by participating in the modern world that Haredim as they exist today could exist. So Haredim are indeed modern. In my book, I call them an alternative religious modernity. I think that's apt, and there are lots of religious modernities. It's not as if some groups are less modern than others. I think the ways that they deal with the modern world are going to be different depending on the kind of community values and structures and all of those kinds of things. But I think there's also some slippage between modern, the way Jewish Orthodox communities use modern, and then the idea of modernity. And
Yeah.
like in my work, modern was really bad. Like it was more goyish or more Gentile, right? So there's that too, which gets sort of wrapped up and confusing. But in terms of like the modern world, like processes of modernity, like Jews were part of that for sure, Haredim in Europe. And I think it's not surprising that the hidden heretics like reach back to the Haskalah and like find so many parallels. I'm just reading a manuscript now that's going to come out soon, where it's an edited volume where some of the authors write about the historical ways of OTD experience. Like these are not new processes. They have different iterations in today's world because we have different technologies, and so like one of the older people that I talked to in Hidden Heretics had been a hidden heretic before the internet. Like he had to go to the public library to find friends, or to Jewish Theological Seminary in Manhattan to find people to talk to, like professors of Jewish literature or whatever. But so, like, the times are different. And I guess academically, we'd say the affordances of the modern world are such that we have different ways to express these kinds of dilemmas or conflicts. But faith and doubt are nothing new. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And the Haskalah is such a fascinating part of Jewish history, this like Jewish enlightenment with that was very rich in writing. And Spinoza is associated with Haskalah, who is sort of universal philosophical import. Um, so maybe moving on a little bit to sort of a slightly new sort of angle on this. You mentioned earlier that patience is an important part of field work. It seems to me just like friendship and socializing and just relationships is also an important part of field work. Can you speak to that?
Sure. I would say actually the most important part is listening. Listening and going beyond yourself. Definitely it's about friendships, but it starts with listening. Like an ethnographer observes and listens beyond herself, because you're not in your own element. So things are different for you. And so you're paying attention to everything. But yes, the bedrock of ethnography is building relationships with people around trust and having people have faith in you that you won't misuse the kinds of things that they're telling them, having trust that they are telling you the truth, or at least their perception of the truth. Um, Double checking. It's not like you just listen. And what part of the participant observation is after every visit you have with somebody or event that you go to, I take field notes. I like, which is like a diary or a journal account, but more analytical about what I experienced. And I also do a lot of audio recording because I'm a linguistic anthropologist too. So when people are okay with it, I record what we say and I transcribe it. Thank you, AI. That has made my life much better.
Mhm.
Um, and so you build a sense where you're looking for patterns. You know what I mean? Like you're looking for patterns where lots of different people are saying similar things. So it's not just an idiosyncrasy of one person. You allow for that idiosyncrasy or that kind of unique experience, but you're seeing patterns across time. And that's why the patience is so important because ethnography takes a long time. It's like a year or two. In my case, I did like really, I mean, I was doing other things like having a regular life, but it took me like 5 years or 4 years of doing the research, figuring out what my research question was, talking to people, really building friendships and relationships. There's a really great article actually about the difference between the different kinds of friendships that anthropologists build. Because one of the most challenging things, I think, especially when you are not far away doing your research, when you're actually sort of at home, as I basically was, is you build real friendships with people and then the research is over and then you're like, what happens now?
Yeah, that's part of the beautiful narrative of the book. I mean, the beautiful narrative of the book is also partly how you create these friendships with people, or these relationships, let's say, with people,
Yeah.
and the way in which they are might be sort of standoffish in the beginning or untrusting of you. And over time, those some of those barriers might come down, and they may welcome you into their social life. Sometimes you even speak to someone's spouse in a really interesting moment in the book. Um, so the question that comes up is, are you able to be objective? And what does objectivity mean in this context?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. So I've been inspired by feminist anthropology and scholarship in general. that holds that nobody is fully objective, that everybody is positioned from somewhere. And this is coming out of scholars of science and technology too, that science is always positioned. But I see anthropology and my work as my encounter with the people I'm working with, what we call our interlocutors. So I can write about that. That's what I write about. And so that's why I refer to myself in the book, because I am writing through my voice and through my experience. I include lots of people's stories in their own voices, but I'm the narrator of this and putting together the data. So I don't claim to be objective. I claim to be thorough and to, again, see those kinds of patterns over time that are accurate. And I think that they are, but it's still it's sort of like a reporter. It's like, well, it's slightly different from a reporter because you're there for longer and you have, well, it's like a longitudinal investigative reporter, very similar to the kind of work that they do, because they build relationships too. But you are always writing from a positioned place.
Yeah. Um,
Let me
another,
just say, let me amend that, which is also that, like, somebody else, you could go and do the same research project and you might get very different results because of who you are. And so that's why it's so important for me in my writing to acknowledge exactly who I am and what my own background is, because I'm going to ask different kinds of questions because of who I am. Even gender is going to really make very different kinds of people accessible to you or not, you know? So who you are really shapes the kinds of stories that people will tell you.
yeah, yeah, it's a beautiful answer. Also, I think related but different is a question of judgment, and how we think about judgment. Just the other day at work, I was talking with a coworker slash friend, and she said, I see these families walking. I work in Brooklyn, right? So this is the same context as I mentioned earlier. I see these families, these mothers dressed very warmly in the summer, pushing a stroller with their kids, and a part of me like feels bad for them, like they're being oppressed, and then another part of me says, isn't that like too judgmental, and isn't there sort of space for all different ways of being? And so how do you think about that? How does that how, the question of judgment, how does that play into your work?
Yeah, I think that's a really good follow-up to your previous question, because one of the things that's so great about writing field notes is you force yourself to see your own judgments, because it's a private place where you're just writing your thoughts about what you just experienced and what you think about it. So you see your judgments. Like, I don't hold back in my field notes. Um, and you challenge them and you wonder, like, because it's not really about me, right? Like, let's say I judge, like, oh, those poor girls wearing buttoned up collars. If I saw that on the page, I would have to question myself and challenge myself, like, this is your own baggage that you're bringing to this. And that might prompt me to then ask some of the young girls or the moms, like, how do you feel about wearing these hot clothes in the summer? Like, so that might provoke new kinds of questions based um on my own responses. And so you use yourself as a kind of sounding board while trying to go beyond yourself.
But what I'm learning from you, what I'm hearing from you, is that it's not being written from nowhere. It's not being trying to attain a place of pure objectivity, and it's not being written from a place of moral relativism where everything is equally the same, but rather there's something else going on that was more complicated, more subtle than that.
Yes, that's totally true. And I think the place where anthropology sometimes gets on shaky ground is, where is the point where you step in and do make a moral judgment? Because at the end of the day, for example, in my work, we're all New York citizens. Like, do I say something about, when I see something that I think is wrong, that's harming somebody? Do I step in? Do I say something? Do I write about that? Like, what don't I write about? And so, I mean, there are parameters in place, like from a university setting, it's called IRB, the Institutional Review Board, that's supposed to help guide ethical research. Um, but these are questions of judgment, as you say. Um, and so I guess my goal would be writing about things that saying, like, for example, like in my first book, I had to write about some of the racism that I witnessed among kids. Um, and at first, I didn't write about that because it really upset me and I didn't know what to do with it. And one of my readers, who was very smart, said, you can't just quote somebody and not actually respond to that. So I wrote about it and I said, this was really upsetting to me. This is why I think this happens. This is sort of the history behind this kind of racism and why I think it's continued on into the United States and why kids are okay saying these kinds of things. I hope that I didn't condone it. On the other hand, I gave it a context where readers can judge for themselves.
Yeah. I think it's a beautiful place to be as I'm thinking from the perspective of a reader, from someone who's engaging with these ideas as well. And a kind of some of the interesting moral questions that come up. I mean, there's a lot of moral questions that come up in this book about double lifers, about people living double lives. There's questions of keeping secrets from your family, basically lying, and even infidelity, as you have people who are living double lives, both inside and outside that world. And then there's these instincts, I think, in everyone, the reader might be to judge very critically, and then I think that the work of interrogating those judgments and assumptions is fruitful work.
I feel like that's what I'm trying to do is interrogate my own judgments in lots of ways and the judgments of what I presume to be my readers.
Mhm.
The interesting part is when people make judgments that I hadn't even expected, you know?
Yeah, 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 for sure. Um, just lingering with these thoughts, about sort of how we think about morality. Yeah, I mean, again, I think the work of interrogating our moral assumptions is always fruitful. I think the work of letting go of certain judgments is always productive, and it doesn't have to. I think it doesn't have to result in a moral relativism, there's still work to do there in thinking deeply about these things. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's the process of interrogation that helps clarify your own belief system and your not your own belief system, but your own sort of moral compass. Like without that kind of interrogation, it's easy to just have knee-jerk responses, like especially in today's world, right? It's easy to just say like, no, that's wrong. It's like I would like I I feel like a lot of my own research is sort of motivated by trying to interrogate what I assume is right, you know?
Okay, let's talk about double lifers.
Okay.
Double lifers is the center focus of Hidden Heretics, and it's this people living double lives inside and outside the Hasidic world. Um, how does one become a double lifer?
First of all, it's not only Hasidim, right? I met lots of Litvish people too, or Yeshivish people. Mostly I heard the same story again and again, which is that young people had questions. They were not answered satisfactorily. They were many of them were kind of shamed into even asking those questions. Um, and they were told to sort of stuff them under the rug, and they did because they were good kids. They came from nice families and they got married, they had kids, and as many people, especially men, told me, the questions came back. And at this point, there were blogs, there people had access to the internet, and they began to explore in ways that would have been much harder. And they found, I think the most important thing about online was not so much information, although that was important too, but they found other people that they respected who were asking similar kinds of questions. And it was those kinds of relationships that really gave people the kind of courage it required to actually act on some of the feelings that they were having, the questions that they were having, because a lot of the communities where double lifers lived, like the explanation for the kinds of questions they were having were that you were experiencing mental illness. Like there was a sense that if you were even asking these questions, there was something wrong with you. And that's where I had to distinguish between different kinds of doubt because everybody has doubts and questions who lives in a religious community. Everyone has doubts and questions in general, but in a religious community, doubt is, I think, part of a life of faith and religiosity. And there are lots of rabbis and bride teachers and mashpiyas, like all kinds of people who will help you if you have questions and that you can talk to. The kind of doubts that the people I was talking to had were doubts that led them all the way to challenging the kind of bases of orthodoxy, like Matan Torah, like did God really give the Ten Commandments to the Jews at Mount Sinai? And when these people decided not, then everything just sort of crumbled for them, and they could no longer continue to believe in in parts of that narrative. So those were the kind that, so I call that life-changing doubt. And it is a doubt that almost pushes you to make changes in your life because your sense of purpose and your sense of how the world is structured is suddenly dramatically, cataclysmically altered.
Yeah. Are you able to maybe give us a little bit of color? Can you share some, either some more general themes or some things a little specific about sort of what you heard, or what you saw? Just the book is filled with these examples of real life stories and colors. Anything that sort of sticks out to you, anything you remember specifically, any person or relationship or question that sort of stayed with you, um, and after this kind of work that you can maybe just share to sort of add some flavor to this experience.
Sure. So I open the book with the story of Yisrael, and this is a pseudonym, of course. Um, but I was, his story really touched me. He sort of did too. He was a very gentle man. And he exactly had that kind of narrative arc. So he was a really good student. He asked his rabbi something about like who made Hashem or something, like a question you're not really supposed to ask. And his rabbi said, like, those kinds of questions come from masturbation. Like, that's it. You're doing something terrible. And he was so startled and fearful that he just shut down. But then he got married and he had kids. And again, his questions came back. And he developed this whole other life, not so much in person, but online, where he was willing to meet me at not kosher restaurants. Like we had to always meet outside of his community. He was really fearful that people would see him. And I think what was so touching about this story was he introduced me to his wife, who was so devastated that he had lost his faith. He had a quote unquote crisis of amina, like a crisis of faith. And I got to know her. And then later, actually, this is after the book was published, I met one of his kids. And so it's these kind of family networks. I'm always really interested in the dynamics among, like within families, especially like when one person changes so dramatically in a family, it has such huge effects, especially if it's the father, because the father in a frum household is supposed to direct. I don't know if they direct so much, but at least is supposed to set the tone for religiosity, right? Like the father's going to make kiddush. In another family that I got to know, like the couple where the husband again lost his faith, like the mother started making kiddush. And I was, of course, like for me, again, this is where my own different background I think is helpful. Like for me, I was like, well, good for her. She gets to make kiddush. But she was heartbroken. She's like, that tells you something's wrong in our family if I'm making kiddush. And we had to explain it to the children. And Tati's not going to make kiddush anymore. Mommy's going to do it. So those kinds of things. Yeah, I think about all these stories a lot.
Yeah, the stories of the kids are always very affecting. Questions of like, you have a father who's maybe listening to secular music or consuming secular information and sharing that with the kids, and then
Yeah.
the kids, you have to be careful what the kids say in school because they can get in trouble or the family
And
can get in
you're
trouble.
responsible for them lying to their teachers. Like it's morally really problematic. At the same time, these are people, and this is where I think it's a misrepresentation. These are not bad people. They were wonderful people. but in order to live some kind of truth for themselves, they had to lie and sometimes encourage their kids to lie. Many of them did so very carefully, like they very quietly introduced new ideas to their kids, like, look, mommy's wearing pajamas, they're pants, it's fine. Like little by little, just introducing new ideas, or call the cleaning lady by her first name, even though she's not Jewish, she has a name. So, like, different ideas about how to be in the world, but it was very subtle. And I think the double lifers that I met were terrified to harm their families. That's why they stayed. Like,
Yeah.
they didn't, especially not only their nuclear families, they didn't want to hurt their parents. Like, so many people said to me, I don't want to break my parents' hearts, you
Yeah.
know? Yeah, this was a really sad book.
Yeah. Yeah. And that comes across. And I think that the experience of undergoing major shifts in a marriage where one person changes in their way of being in the world and their belief system is actually completely universal.
Yes.
Yeah, in my own life, I mean, I tell people, I got married at 21. My wife was 20, which was way too young. We're happily married till today, and that's not hasn't been a problem. But we're completely different people. We're completely radically different people today than we were then. Unrecognizably different.
Yep.
And again, I think I would say roll of the dice, it worked out, but it doesn't have to work out necessarily. And then the question becomes, what cost are you willing to pay to keep the family together?
That's right.
Which is a question that I think the whole modern world is grappling with.
Yes.
It's a tough question to answer.
Yep. Actually, one of my friends read the book in a draft, and she's not Jewish. And she kept saying to me, these are universal questions that everybody grapples with. You have a particular group who's grappling with them in this very particular kind of way, but you should really write about these as universal. And I think you're right. They are universal. But there are very particular consequences for being somebody who's Haredi and living a double life. And I think it's especially around kids and marriage that you see a lot of that, because if for some reason the marriage falls apart, and sometimes that does happen, if neither party is willing to have, to kind of live that kind of life together, then who gets the children is really complicated. And I heard a lot of stories about, especially women not having access to their children, because the community put all of its resources behind the still frum parent, um, because they thought, not because they were terrible, but because they thought it would be in the best interest of the child. On the other, which, okay, that's probably true. On the other hand, then they lose a parent, you know? There are a few people in the book who have managed to kind of do a balancing act where they got divorced, each spouse remarried, one person is no longer Orthodox, still observant but not Orthodox, and they have maintained relationships with their kids, like close relationships, but that's very, very hard. And I think you have to have resources to be able to do that.
Yeah. I think of Shalom Dean's memoir, All Who Go Do Not Return, as an example of a very sad story in that family respect, from the perspective of the family.
I think people who go OTD like that, I think it's often one of the tragic parts of
Yeah.
that.
And I happen to know just personally, I think, I mean, two of my closest friends are off the derech from Hasidic world. And so a friend of a friend, someone in that group also, had a similar leaving the world and also leaving the family behind and their kids behind to some extent, which is very sad. I would say to a large extent, I would say like really left their kids behind, which is really sad. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there's no option. I hope that that's changing a little bit. I know that there's different therapists now in from communities who are saying, you don't have to cut all your ties. It might not have the same huge impact on shidduchim as it used to, because it's much more common, or at least it's not quite as shocking. Like in large families, usually one person goes off the derech, or not even off the derech, but might become modern Orthodox or some kind of change that's not okay with the family. So I know that there are some therapists, Haredi therapists, who are saying like you need to prioritize your relationship with your child before religion. And that's really a big change just from the time I've been doing the research.
Yeah, therapy plays a large role in the book. The question of who has authority to guide people, to help people, and you talk about therapy as being a double-edged sword, or sort of applying both ways, where in some cases it could be a huge relief to speak to an objective therapist and to be able to talk, and in other cases, the Jewish sanctioned therapist can have very what's the word, judgmental or ideologically motivated kind of approach, and that could be very very stifling, probably even traumatic for people. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't expect therapy to have such a big role because I didn't know people got sent to therapists. But one of the first things that a still religious spouse would do would be to ask their spouse to go talk to a rav or their rabbi, and the rabbi would often then send the person to a therapist. The question is, what kind of therapist, which therapist? And as you say, like some therapists were really helpful, not only for the person individually, but in negotiating the family dynamics and the kinds of decisions that couples had to make together for their family if they were going to continue to be married. Um, and then there were some just kind of horror stories of the, I would say, sort of therapy that was harmful in terms of one person in particular was prescribed medication inappropriately for things that she didn't really have, in a way, just sort of shutting her up, like making sure that she just, and again, not because these are bad people, these are people who wanted to help, but helping was keeping somebody in a certain position at any cost or at a cost that maybe other people would not think was okay.
Yeah, and he had a beautiful reference to Michel Foucault's, I think, is it Civilization and Madness? Is that his essay or book about uh, Foucault growing up in a society where homosexuality was stigmatized? He also, I think, saw very clearly the way that therapy can become a tool for policing normalcy and punishing deviancy. And again, so that aspect of therapy sort of comes up in this book, and I thought it was very, very interesting.
Yeah, totally. And as a matter of fact, there is a conversion therapy organization that's from Jonah. And even though conversion therapy was debunked and outlawed in New York State, Jonah, when I was writing, was going to be invited to a conference, and then they were not. But there is a, like, I did a lot of comparison between conversion therapy among evangelicals and then conversion therapy for from Jews, and was using that model in a lot of ways. Yeah.
I think an interest of yours is gender. And so what can you share about the difference double lifer experiences you saw for men and women in the people you studied?
Yeah, I think because the from communities that I was in are so gender segregated, it's unsurprising that living a double life would also be gendered and so differently. But what I discovered was that there were structural differences. And one of the first that really surprised me that I hadn't thought about was what happens at marriage. So let's say all of the people who became double lifers had questions, probably as teenagers. That seems like it's a pretty normal phase in from adolescence. Like lots of people told me about how they had questions. But at the point of marriage, a man's world, a young man's world, like opens up. He's not in yeshiva, maybe he's just part-time at yeshiva, and he has a lot of mobility. From women, when they get married, are suddenly in the home. Before that, like high school girls, I see them all over Manhattan, like hanging out with their friends, having a great time, it looks like. But so at the point of marriage, women's lives get really constrained. Like their husbands have a right to ask them where they're going and what they're doing, and they're supposed to be at home with their kids or at home taking care of their husbands. Even emotionally, there were really big differences. Like men were devastated when they stopped believing, when their faith sort of crumbled. The women I talked to were angry. They were like, I've been doing all this stuff because I believed in it. I gave up these things. One young woman told me she wanted to be a rabbi, and then she figured she was told that she couldn't because she was a girl. And she put aside those kinds of intellectual interests to be a wife and a mother. When she sort of had that crisis of faith, she's like, I gave up so much, but I didn't have to. And so I think there was a kind of difference in that way. And then even in terms of once people began living double lives, again, men could go explore and hang out with their friends. It was really hard for women to get together. Like we were supposed to have a barbecue. I was so excited because I was finally invited. And like, I think it was supposed to be Memorial Day and we met. No, it was supposed to be around Pesach and then we met finally at the end of May. Like it took months and months before everyone could get together because women's time is so short. They're really busy.
Yeah. Maybe as we wrap up here, can we talk a little bit about sort of um what you're thinking about and working on next and maybe sort of think about sort of the through lines and the connection between sort of your like what drives you and what you're always sort of what you're really interested in as you continue to pursue new exploration and thought.
Sure. Um, so I'm working on a project now. Right now I'm working on an article on from influencers. But I'm generally, since really the measles epidemic, I've gotten quite interested in issues around health and wellness, and also connections between Haredim and non-Jews, like that kind of interreligious um, kind of working together on social, not working together necessarily, but the kind of affinities that I see happening around social issues like traditional families and gender, but using the lens of health. So I'm really interested in like vaccination and alternative health therapies. That's been really fun to research. Especially the roles of moms in taking authority to kind of care for their families. Let me say one more thing I'm working on that I forgot to mention. I'm also working with a colleague, Rachel Feldman. We're doing a really fun project on Haredi tourism to Amish in Lancaster County and the kind of kosher collaborations that we're seeing also around issues of health and wellness in terms of like natural produce and dairy in particular, like milk, Chalav Yisrael, and coming from Amish farms and stuff like that.
And these are questions that so many Americans are dealing with, not just the Haredi world. Yeah.
Well, that's why I'm interested in them. And I guess the through line is coming at sort of more mainstream concerns that we all have about health and government responsibility and individual authority, but coming at it from how a Haredi perspective as much as I can, because I feel like the Jewish perspective is not always included in a lot of the sociological and anthropological literature. And I think it has a lot to offer in terms of taking a step back or at least looking from a different perspective.
All right. Um, is it okay if we wrap up here?
Yes, that sounds great. That was fun.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this really, really lovely discussion. I strongly recommend the book. I think it has universal appeal and universal themes. And I think especially anyone living in the New York area where your neighbors, these are your neighbors, and they're so different and they're also human. They're so human. So it's such universal stories and explorations and questions. And so I would strongly recommend the book to anyone. And thank you so much for your time today and for this really lovely conversation.
I want to thank you. Like you were such a good reader. You picked out all the really key themes, and it was very provocative in a good way to talk to you. Thank you.